My daughter looked at me, her eyes as cold as the marble floor in the lawyer's office, and said the words that shattered my world. "Find somewhere else to die, old man. You're useless now." She had just been named the heir to $33 million from my late wife. I was left with nothing. But what she didn't know was that my wife, the most brilliant woman I ever knew, had left behind one final secret test, and the clock to pass it was already ticking. The house was too quiet. A week after we buried Eleanor, the silence had become a physical presence, a weight in every room. I ran a soft cloth over the walnut cabinet in the living room, feeling the familiar grain under my palm. Ellie and I had designed it together, sketching it out on a napkin one evening. I had spent a month in my workshop, bringing it to life. Every joint, every curve was a memory. The air still held a faint trace of her, a mix of lavender and old books. It was the only thing that felt real. The sound of a car engine, a low, arrogant purr, sliced through the quiet. I looked out the window to see a black Tesla gliding up the driveway. My daughter Claire and her husband Julian. They stepped out, dressed in black, that looked more like a fashion statement than mourning. Claire held her phone like a shield. Julian's eyes swept across the property, not with sadness, but with the cold appraisal of a surveyor. I opened the door before they knocked. Arthur Julian said, his voice smooth and clipped. He used my full name, something no one in the family ever did. It was a businessman's greeting. Cold. Distant. Claire murmured "Dad" without meeting my eyes. They walked inside. Julian's expensive cologne filled the space, a harsh chemical scent that fought with the lavender. He didn't stop in the entryway, but paced into the living room, his hands behind his back. "We need to be efficient about this art," he said, looking at the custom-built mantelpiece. "The reading is tomorrow. We should get our ducks in a row." I stared at him. My wife, his mother-in-law, had been gone for 7 days. Ducks in a row. I repeated, my voice raspy. "He means we just want to make sure the process is streamlined," Claire said quickly, finally looking at me. Her eyes were tired, but there was a flicker of impatience in them. Mom wouldn't want a long, drawn-out affair. I knew my wife. Eleanor would have wanted grace. She would have wanted time to breathe. What Claire and Julian wanted was speed. Julian stopped in front of the window overlooking the garden. "The land value here has skyrocketed. Good schools close to the city. This lot alone is a significant asset." He wasn't talking about the rose bushes Ellie had planted. He was talking about square footage. He was talking about money. "Your mother loved this house," I said, my voice quiet. "And it's a wonderful testament to her success," Julian countered, turning to face me, "which is why we need to manage her legacy properly, unlock its potential, not let it sit here like some museum." The word stung. Museum. As if my life, our life, was a collection of relics behind glass. Claire walked over to a shelf filled with Eleanor's scientific awards. She picked one up, a heavy glass sculpture, and weighed it in her hand. "Julian's right, Dad. We have to be practical. It's what Mom would want. She was always practical. She was brilliant," I wanted to scream. "She was kind. She was the love of my life." But I said nothing. I just stood there in the quiet house watching my daughter and her husband dismantle my wife's memory before the will was even read. They weren't here to comfort me. They were here to claim their prize. Elias Vance, my younger brother, ran a law practice in a downtown building made of old brick and dark wood. His office smelled of leather and justice. It was a place of certainty, a place where words had weight. I sat across from his large mahogany desk, feeling small in my only suit. Claire and Julian sat beside me, looking like they owned the room. They leaned forward slightly, a predatory stillness in their posture. Elias looked at me with sad eyes before he began. He cleared his throat and put on his reading glasses. I am reading from the last will and testament of Dr. Eleanor Vance. He began, his voice formal. He spoke of my wife's brilliance, of the groundbreaking pharmaceutical patent she had developed years ago. He explained how her genius, her patience, had been the seed that grew their entire fortune. I watched Claire's face. There was no flicker of pride, only anticipation. Julian tapped his fingers impatiently on the leather armrest. Then Elias arrived at the crucial passage. Regarding all my worldly assets, including the property at 45 Serenity Lane and the entirety of the E. Vance investment portfolio, currently valued at $33,240,000. I bequeath in its entirety to my beloved daughter, Claire Thompson. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs. $33 million. And nothing for me. Not a mention. Not a dollar. The room tilted. Julian's face broke into a tight, triumphant smile. He squeezed Claire's shoulder. Claire let out a slow breath, a sound of profound relief, as if she had been holding it for her entire life. She looked beautiful and terrifying in that moment. I gripped the arms of my chair. My mind raced. All the years I had worked in the shop, taking on extra commissions so she could stay in the lab. All the nights I had waited up. All the sacrifices. For this to be erased, Elias looked up from the paper, his eyes finding mine. He opened his mouth to speak again, a warning in his expression. Claire, it is vital that you understand the full terms of this inheritance. There is a specific clause. But Julian stood up, cutting him off. Thank you, Uncle Elias. That's perfectly clear. He was all business now, pulling Claire to her feet. We appreciate you handling this so efficiently. We have a lot to do. They turned to leave, a united front of sudden spectacular wealth. Elias started to protest, but the conditions. We'll have our own lawyers review the final paperwork, Julian said dismissively over his shoulder. Don't worry, we'll handle it from here. And just like that, they were gone. They left me sitting in the silence, the echo of their victory ringing in my ears. I looked at my brother. He just shook his head slowly, the will still open in his hands, the most important words still unread. When I got back, the locks were already being changed. A locksmith's van was parked in the driveway, right where Ellie used to park her old sedan. Julian stood on the porch, directing the work like a general. Claire was inside. I could see her through the window, talking on the phone, gesturing animatedly. She was already redecorating in her mind. I walked up the steps, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. What is this? Julian turned, surprised to see me. He gave me a thin, placating smile. Just a security upgrade, Art. Can't be too careful with an estate of this size. I live here, Julian. About that, he said, stepping in front of the door. Claire came out, her phone pressed to her ear. She ended the call and looked at me. Her expression wasn't apologetic. It was resolute. Dad, she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. You need to leave. We'll be putting the house on the market next week. I felt my legs tremble. Your mother, she would have wanted me to be safe here. This is my home. A bitter laugh escaped Claire's lips. Mother isn't here anymore, and her will made her wishes perfectly clear. She took a step closer, her face hardening into a mask I had never seen before. She looked down at me, at my worn jacket, at my calloused hands. And then she said the words that would echo in my mind for the rest of my days. Find somewhere else to die, she said, her voice quiet and sharp as a shard of glass. You're useless now. Julian, ever the efficient one, stepped forward and pushed a small, empty cardboard box into my hands. You've got an hour, he said, and then he turned and went back inside. The door clicked shut, the sound of the new lock engaging, echoing in the sudden silence. I stood there on the porch, clutching the box, a ghost in the ruins of my own life. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and disinfectant, the chemical ghost of 1,000 strangers who had slept here and left nothing behind. A neon sign outside the window buzzed, casting a sickly green light that pulsed against the stained wallpaper. This was the landscape of erasure, a place where a man could disappear and no one would notice. I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress sagging under my weight, and stared at my hands. These were the hands that had learned the language of wood. They knew the difference between oak and maple by touch alone. They had held Eleanor's face, built a cradle for our daughter, and crafted a life from sawdust and dedication. For 40 years, I had believed in the honesty of tangible things, in the truth you could feel in a perfectly sanded surface. Now these hands were empty. They rested on my knees, calloused and quiet, the tools of a life that had been declared obsolete. I was 65 years old, and I was worthless. The thought was a cold, smooth stone in my gut. It wasn't just about the house. It wasn't even about the $33 million, a number so vast, it felt like a fiction. It was about Eleanor. My Ellie. Had our life been a lie? Had the 40 years we'd spent building a world together been just a long-term business arrangement for her, one where I was the silent partner written out of the final ledger? A memory surfaced, sharp and painful. We were in our 20s, living in a tiny apartment that was always cold. She was hunched over a microscope, her brow furrowed in concentration, while I was sketching a design for a bookshelf to hold her heavy textbooks. She had looked up at me, her eyes bright with a fire that could change the world, and said, "One day, Art. One day, this will all pay off. For us. For us." She had said, "us." I got up and paced the narrow space between the bed and the wall. The carpet was thin and abrasive under my socks. Was this the payoff she had envisioned me, in a nameless motel room, while our daughter and her predator of a husband liquidated our shared dreams? Julian's smug face flashed in my mind. His talk of dead assets and unlocking liquidity. He spoke a different language, a tongue where love and memory had no market value. And Claire, my daughter, had learned to speak it fluently. Find somewhere else to die. The words echoed in the cheap room. They weren't spoken in anger. They were spoken like a simple, practical instruction, like telling a delivery man to leave a package on the porch. That was what hurt the most. The sheer, effortless cruelty of it. How had my hands, the hands that taught her how to hold a hammer, failed so completely to build a heart inside her? I sank back onto the bed, the wave of despair so heavy I thought it might crush me. My entire life's philosophy, the belief that hard work, loyalty, and love built a foundation that could withstand any storm, had crumbled into dust. Eleanor, my brilliant, meticulous Ellie, had written the demolition order herself. She had placed the dynamite at the base of everything I was, and our daughter had lit the fuse. I pulled my wallet from my pocket. Tucked behind my driver's license was a faded photograph of Eleanor. She was standing on the porch of the house, laughing, the summer sun catching in her hair. She looked so full of life, so full of a future she believed we would share. I looked at her smiling face, at the light in her eyes. It was the face of the woman who had held my hand when my own father died, the woman who had called my workshop her favorite place on earth. It was not the face of a betrayer. But the will said otherwise. The paper, the cold, hard words read by my own brother, said otherwise. "Why, Ellie?" I whispered to the photograph, my voice cracking. "Why would you do this to me, to us? Was I not a good husband? Was my work, was my love not enough?" The neon sign buzzed. A truck roared past on the highway. The room offered no answers. The silence was absolute. And in that silence, I knew I couldn't let this be the end of the story. It wasn't anger that fueled me. It was a desperate, burning need to understand. I couldn't spend the rest of my days, however many were left, believing that the love of my life had erased me. I had to know why. I couldn't let it end like this. I couldn't let the final chapter of my life be a story of betrayal written by the woman I loved. Despair was a suffocating blanket, but underneath it, a single stubborn ember of defiance began to glow. I refused to be a ghost. I refused to let my wife's memory be a weapon used against me. I needed an answer. My hands felt clumsy, thick with grief as I fumbled through my wallet. There it was, a crisp business card with a simple, elegant font. Elias Vance, attorney at law. My brother. The polished surface felt foreign, a relic from a world of meetings and contracts that I no longer belonged to. My thumb hovered over the number on my phone. My heart hammered against my ribs. Making this call felt like admitting the finality of it all, like accepting that my family was now a legal matter. But the alternative, the not knowing, was a poison that would kill me faster than any eviction notice. I pressed the screen. The phone rang once, twice. My breath caught in my throat. Elias Vance. His voice was professional, cautious. "Eli, it's Art." There was a pause on the other end. Then his voice softened, filled with a pained relief. "Art. Thank God you called. I've been so worried." Tears pricked at the back of my eyes, hot and sharp. I fought them back. I would not fall apart. Not now. "Listen," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You don't have to answer if it breaks any rules. I'm not calling to fight it. I have to know." I took a shaky breath. "Tell me what I did wrong, Eli. Please. Just tell me why she would do this to me." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty. It was filled with a tension that vibrated through the line. "Art." Elias said, his voice low and urgent. "You didn't do anything wrong. And that's not what Eleanor did. It's not what you think." He hesitated. "Can you come to my office right now?" What you heard yesterday, it was only the first sentence of the last chapter. The tea Elias placed in front of me was hot, the steam rising in a steady column in the quiet office. I wrapped my hands around the ceramic mug, borrowing its warmth. Elias sat back in his own chair, the picture of professional calm, but his eyes held the deep, weary sadness of a man who had been forced to watch his own family tear itself apart. "You didn't do anything wrong, Art," he said, his voice low and firm. "I'm sorry I couldn't stop them yesterday." Julian was determined to hear only what he wanted to hear. He sighed, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "But that's his mistake, not yours, and certainly not Eleanor's." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Ellie was the most brilliant person I have ever known. Not just in a laboratory. She understood people, Art. She understood their patterns, their motivations, their weaknesses." He let that last word hang in the air for a moment. She saw this coming. She saw Julian's ambition, and she saw the influence he had over Claire. She didn't build a wall to keep them out. She built a labyrinth, and she handed them the map knowing they would be too arrogant to read it. I looked at him confused. Elias, what are you talking about? She gave everything to Claire. No, my brother said, shaking his head slowly. She didn't. She gave Claire a test. He reached across the desk and turned the will to face me, his finger tracing a line of text my eyes had been too blurred with grief to even register. She named Claire as the temporary trustee Art, not the final owner. The inheritance only becomes fully hers if she abides by an unbreakable covenant. Eleanor called it the Phoenix Clause. My heart began to beat a little faster. A clause, what clause? Elias took a deep breath. The clause states that Claire's role as trustee is contingent upon her absolute commitment to maintaining and honoring the family's dual legacy. He looked up at me to make sure I was listening. She defined that legacy in two parts. Part 1, the scientific legacy of Eleanor Vance, which is the source of the wealth. And Part 2, he paused, his voice softening, the artistic and personal legacy of Arthur Vance defined as his life's work, his comfort, his safety, and his personal dignity. The words hung in the air, rearranging the molecules of the room. Dignity. When Claire and Julian threw you out of your home, Elias continued, his voice hardening, they didn't just perform an act of cruelty. They fundamentally violated the core condition of the will. They took a wrecking ball to the second half of the legacy. I felt a tremor go through me, not of fear, but of a seismic shift. I had to place a hand flat on the desk to steady myself. So what? What happens? Ellie knew Claire could be impulsive, that Julian could push her. Elias explained. So she built in a fail-safe. The will gives Claire exactly 3 days, 72 hours from the moment of the violation to rectify her actions. A chance to apologize. A chance to bring you home. A chance to choose her father over a real estate deal. And if she doesn't, I whispered. Elias's face was grim. If the violation is not corrected by the deadline, Claire's trusteeship is immediately and irrevocably voided. Her access to every account is severed. The house is no longer under her control. The entire $33 million estate is automatically transferred to the secondary beneficiary. I stared at him, my mind struggling to keep up. A secondary beneficiary. Another family member. A charity. So this was the moment. My brother looked me straight in the eye, and for the first time since the funeral, I saw a glimmer of light. The assets transfer to a charitable foundation your wife secretly established 2 years ago. It's called the Vance Eleanor Foundation for Applied Crafts and Sciences. The name was a punch to the gut, a beautiful, perfect combination of everything we were. And Elias said, leaning in, delivering the final impossible truth according to the Foundation's charter, which Eleanor had me draft and file myself, there is only one person with the authority to run it. The sole executive director, the man with full control over its board, its mission and its $33 million endowment, with a mandated 6-figure salary for his service, is you, Arthur Vance. I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to shrink, the sounds of the city outside fading into a dull roar. Me, in charge. It wasn't possible. It was a dream. Ellie gave her a test, Art. Elias said softly, his voice full of a brother's love and an admirer's awe. A final exam of character. And she trusted you and only you to be the one to grade it. I looked down at my hands again. They weren't empty anymore. They were holding the weight of my wife's boundless love, her brilliant mind, and a justice so profound It felt like a force of nature. The clock was ticking, and for the first time in a very long week, I knew exactly what time it was. It was time for the grading to begin. I walked back into that anonymous hotel room a different man. The despair was gone, replaced by a cold, quiet resolve that settled deep in my bones. The buzzing neon sign outside the window no longer seemed pathetic. It was a witness. I was no longer a victim waiting for the end. I was the executor of my wife's final brilliant design. The thought was a strange comfort, a shield against the grief. Ellie was gone, but her mind, her love, her fierce protection of me, that was still here. It was alive in the pages of her will. I sat on the edge of the stiff bed and looked at my phone. My first instinct was to call Claire to tell her to warn her, to give her the chance that in my heart I felt she didn't deserve. But Elias's words and Eleanor's own echoed in my mind. This was a test, and you don't give the answers to someone taking a test. You simply watch them write their own fate. So I put the phone down. I would not call. I would let the clock tick. I would let my daughter decide what kind of person she was going to be. Meanwhile, across town, the celebration had already begun. Julian Thompson was a man who believed the universe owed him a victory, and now that it had arrived, he was wasting no time. He stood on the patio of their rented modern home, a phone pressed to his ear, a glass of expensive scotch in his hand. He wasn't talking to friends. He was talking to his broker. "That's right, liquidate the entire municipal bond portfolio," he said, his voice sharp with command. "It's a dead asset, low yield. I want to move at least 15 million into the new Etheria Tech Fund. High risk, high reward. It's time to put this capital to work." He took a long sip of his drink, a predator who had just been handed the keys to the zoo. An hour later, he posted a photo to his LinkedIn profile. It was a picture of him and Claire, their arms around each other, champagne glasses raised. Behind them, the sun was setting. The caption was a masterpiece of corporate gloating, disguised as sentiment. "Honoring the incredible legacy of my late mother-in-law, Eleanor Vance, by ensuring her capital continues to innovate and grow. The Thompson family is entering a new era, a new beginning." Claire, for her part, was busy making that new beginning a tangible reality. She spent the morning at a Lucid dealership, the sleek electric cars gleaming around her like promises. "I'll take the Air Grand Touring," she told the salesman, not asking the price. "In the quantum gray. And I want the full panoramic roof." It was the car she had been talking about for months, a dream that was now just an item on a checklist. Her next call was to the most exclusive private academy in Denver, a place with a waiting list a decade long, and tuition that rivaled a college education. "Yes, this is Claire Thompson," she said, her voice dripping with newfound importance. "I'm calling about the enrollment for my son Leo. I'd like to pay the full tuition deposit for the next 5 years. Yes, today." They were spending money they didn't have. Or rather, they were spending money that was only conditionally theirs, a fact they were blissfully unaware of. Every purchase, every boastful post was another step into the trap Eleanor had so carefully laid. That evening, Elias forwarded me the link to Julian's post. I looked at the picture. My daughter was smiling, a wide, brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was holding a champagne glass, but it looked like she was holding a trophy. I saw the comments flooding in from their circle of wealthy friends. "Congratulations! Amazing news! Eleanor would be so proud." Would she? I thought of Ellie in her lab, her hands stained with chemicals, her mind wrestling with complex formulas. Her pride was never in the money itself, but in the problems it could solve. Julian and Claire didn't see problems to solve. They saw a shopping list. I looked at the cheap clock on the motel nightstand. Its red numbers glowed in the dim room. 36 hours had passed. 36 hours were left. I felt a pang of sorrow for the daughter I remembered, the little girl who used to bring me dandelions from the yard. Where had she gone? Had she been buried under the weight of Julian's ambition? Or had this greedy, careless woman been there all along, just waiting for her chance? I didn't know the answer. But I knew that Eleanor had. She had seen this possibility, and she had built one final equation to solve it, a test of character with a 72-hour time limit. I turned my phone face down. The feast of greed would continue for a little while longer, but the clock was ticking, and soon the bill would come due. It was the morning of the third day, the final day. I met Elias at a small diner on the outskirts of the city, a place with worn vinyl booths and coffee that was honest, if not good. The air smelled of bacon and regret. We sat in a corner booth, a silent pact between us. The 72-hour clock was ticking down, and every minute felt as heavy as an hour. I hadn't slept. I'd spent the night watching the city lights from my hotel window, wrestling with the ghost of my own conscience. Maybe I should call her Eli, I said, stirring my coffee. One last time, for her mother's sake. Maybe she just needs a reminder. Elias looked at me, his eyes full of a brother's understanding. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed, cream-colored envelope. My name was written on the front in Eleanor's elegant, precise script. She knew you'd say that, he said softly. She knew your heart, Art. She left this for you, to be opened only on the morning of the third day if you were wavering. My fingers trembled as I took it. The paper felt warm, as if it still held a part of her. I broke the seal. The letter inside was short, but every word was a testament to the woman I had loved. My dearest Arthur, it began. If you are reading this, it means our daughter is at a crossroads, and you are doubting your own strength. Do not. What we have set in motion is not cruelty. It is the final, hardest act of a mother's love, allowing a child to face the consequences of her own choices. I love Claire with every fiber of my being, but I see the world she has chosen. I see the man she has married. They are adrift in a sea of wanting, and they will pull you under with them if you let them. This dichuk is not a punishment. It is a lifeboat. It is designed to save her from the worst version of herself and to save you from being the casualty of her weakness. Your dignity is the only asset that truly matters. Do not let her sell it. Trust the plan. Trust me. All my love always, Ellie. I folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. The doubt was gone, burned away by the clarity of her words. She had seen it all. She had known, and she had trusted me to be strong enough. I looked across the table at my brother. Okay, I said, my voice steady now. Let the clock run out. The rest of the day was a slow, agonizing crawl toward 5 o'clock. Elias's phone buzzed occasionally, with updates from his paralegal who was monitoring their activity. At 11 a.m., Julian transferred another $2 million from the main brokerage account into a high-risk private equity fund he controlled. At 2 p.m., Claire finalized the purchase of a timeshare in Aspen. At 4:30, Julian posted another photo of them on a yacht, a picture from a previous vacation, with the caption, "The future is bright. Time to enjoy the fruits of a life well lived." They weren't just spending the money. They were spitting on her grave with every transaction. Each update was another twist of the knife, another confirmation that Eleanor had been right. At 4:59, Elias and I stood by the window of his office looking down at the city streets below. The afternoon traffic was beginning to build. People were heading home, their day's work done. Our work was just beginning. The clock on his wall, a beautiful piece I had made for him years ago from cherry wood, clicked over. 5 o'clock. The deadline had passed. The 72 hours of grace were gone. I looked at Elias. He looked at me. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a deep, somber resolution. I gave a single, deliberate nod. He walked to his desk and sat down in front of his laptop. He didn't slam the keys or make a grand pronouncement. The end of their world began with a series of quiet, methodical clicks. Email to the trust department at Morgan Stanley. He murmured, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Invoking Article 4, Section B, the Phoenix Clause. All assets to be frozen and transferred to the Foundation effective immediately. Click. Email to the brokerage house. Cease all trading on account number 77B4. Authorize transfer of all holdings to the Foundation. Click. Email to the security firm managing the smart home system at 45 Serenity Lane. Deactivate all existing user access. Grant sole administrative control to the Foundation's director, Arthur Vance. Click. He looked up at me. It's done, he said. I looked out the window. The city was still moving, the cars still flowing, the lights beginning to dot the landscape as dusk approached. Nothing in the world outside had changed. But for Claire and Julian, a tsunami had just been unleashed. The trap was sprung, and the bait had been taken with an appetite that had sealed their fate. The charity gala was a symphony of discreet wealth. Crystal glasses chimed, a string quartet played softly in the corner, and the air hummed with the low murmur of money talking to money. Julian was in his element. He stood at the center of a small circle of investors, his voice confident, his gestures expansive. He was explaining his strategy for the newly acquired capital, using words like disruption and aggressive growth. Claire moved through the room like a queen in her new kingdom. A diamond necklace, a purchase from 2 days ago, glittered at her throat. She accepted condolences for her mother with a graceful, practiced sadness, before seamlessly pivoting to talk about the new wing of the museum she planned to fund. They were the evening's power couple, their grief a tragic and compelling backstory to their spectacular new fortune. They were performing, and they were brilliant at it. The silent auction was the centerpiece of the evening. A large screen displayed the leading bids. Julian, with a flourish, raised his paddle for the grand prize, a week-long stay on a private island. "Let's put the bid at 50,000, he announced to the table loud enough for everyone to hear. It's for a good cause, after all. The auctioneer recognized him, and the room applauded his generosity. At the end of the night, a waiter approached their table with a small leather-bound bill folder. Julian took it, barely glancing at the total. He produced a black metal American Express card and handed it over with a casual flick of his wrist. A few minutes later, the waiter returned, his face a mask of professional apology. He leaned down and spoke in a low voice, but the sudden silence at the table made his words feel like a shout. "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Thompson. The card has been declined." Julian stared at him. "That's impossible. Run it again." "I have, sir. 3 times. The investors at the table suddenly found their shoes very interesting. Julian's face flushed a deep, ugly red. "Fine," he snapped, pulling out another card, a platinum Visa. "Use this one." The waiter retreated. Julian attempted a laugh. "Must be a glitch in the system. These things happen." But no one laughed with him. Claire's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it, her brow furrowing. An email. The subject line was stark. "Urgent legal notification, breach of fiduciary duty, estate of Eleanor Vance." Her blood went cold. She tapped it open. The text was a wall of dense legal language, but the meaning was brutally clear. Violation of the Phoenix Clause. Trusteeship is hereby declared null and void. All access to associated assets is terminated effective 5 p.m. The waiter was returning an even more pained expression on his face. He didn't even have to speak. Julian snatched the card from the tray. Declined this one too. His own phone began to ring, a frantic, vibrating buzz against the white tablecloth. It was his private banker at Morgan Stanley. "Julian, what the hell is going on?" he hissed into the phone. The voice on the other end was cold, stripped of its usual friendly tone. "Mr. Thompson, I'm afraid all accounts linked to the Vance estate have been frozen by a court order. We cannot process any transactions. Furthermore, our risk department has flagged your recent transfer of $15 million as a potentially fraudulent conveyance." Fraudulent. The words sucked the air from Julian's lungs. Claire grabbed his arm, her knuckles white. She shoved her phone in his face, her finger trembling on the email from Elias. Julian's eyes darted across the screen. Temporary trustee. Unbreakable covenant. Violation. It was happening. It was all falling apart. His phone buzzed again. An email from the compliance officer at his firm. Subject: immediate review. Unsecured capital injection. The email was a nightmare. It informed him that the source of the funds for his Etheria Tech Fund investment was now in legal dispute. It warned that if the funds were found to be misappropriated, he would be facing not just professional ruin, but criminal charges. The room was starting to whisper. The circle of investors was now a circle of spectators watching the Thompsons implode. "We have to go," Julian said through clenched teeth. He threw a few $100 bills on the table and grabbed Claire's arm, pulling her toward the exit. They walked a gauntlet of curious, pitying, and scornful eyes. Their perfect evening, their grand debut as the city's new philanthropists, had ended in utter humiliation. They ran through the valet area, ignoring the attendant, and squealed out of the parking lot in Claire's new Lucid. The silence in the car was thick with panic and disbelief. "What does this mean, Julian?" Claire cried, her voice thin and reedy. "What did he do? Your mother did this," Julian snarled, gripping the steering wheel. "That brilliant, manipulative woman. She built a bomb into her own will." They raced toward Serenity Lane, toward the one solid thing they thought they had left. The house. Their house. But as they rounded the final corner, the flashing blue and red lights painted the dark trees in strobes of doom. A police car was parked discreetly at the end of the driveway. A professional security guard in a crisp uniform stood at the entrance to the property. And standing there under the soft glow of the porch light was Elias Vance. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry. He was simply a fact as solid and immovable as the law itself. Julian slammed on the brakes. They stumbled out of the car. "You can't do this," Claire screamed. "This is our house." Elias just looked at her, his expression one of profound disappointment. "No, Claire," he said, his voice carrying in the cold night air. "It isn't. Not anymore." The security guard stepped forward and handed Julian a thick, sealed envelope. Inside was a formal notice of eviction, a court-ordered restraining order, and a copy of the deed newly filed that afternoon naming the Vance Eleanor Foundation as the sole owner. Their key was useless. The locks had been changed. They were trespassing. They were locked out, standing on the cold asphalt, with nothing but the designer clothes on their backs and the echoing ruin of their own greed. The knock on my motel room door wasn't a knock. It was a frantic, desperate pounding, the sound of a world that had come completely off its hinges. It was just after midnight. I had been sitting in the dark, watching the headlights of passing trucks paint fleeting stripes across the ceiling. I wasn't waiting for them, but I knew they would come. You don't detonate a $33 million bomb under someone's life and not expect to feel the shockwave. I opened the door. They looked like ghosts haunting the wrong house. Julian's expensive suit was rumpled, his tie gone, the collar of his shirt unbuttoned. His hair, usually so perfectly styled, was a mess where he had been running his hands through it. The supreme confidence was gone from his eyes, replaced by a hollow, hunted look I had never seen before. He looked like a man who had just learned the law of gravity by falling from a great height. Claire was worse. Her mascara had run, leaving black trails down her cheeks. Her beautiful designer dress was wrinkled, and she was shivering, though the night wasn't particularly cold. They stood there in the harsh yellow light of the motel corridor, two beautiful, ruined people who had discovered that money was not a god but merely a fair-weather friend. Claire stumbled forward, her hands outstretched. "Dad," she sobbed, the word tearing from her throat. "Dad, please. You have to help us, please." She tried to grab my arm, but I didn't move. "They've frozen everything," Julian said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The accounts, the cards. The firm called me. The investors. My God. Art, my investors are pulling out. They're talking about fraud. My career. My entire life is over." He looked around the shabby motel room as if he couldn't comprehend how he had ended up in such a place. He wasn't apologizing. He was listing his damages, as if expecting my insurance to cover them. "You have to call Elias at Claire," pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Tell him it was a misunderstanding. Tell him you were confused. I'll do anything, Dad. I'll get on my knees. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it. I swear I didn't mean it." I looked at my daughter, at this stranger wearing her face, and I felt nothing but a vast, empty calm. The storm had passed through me and left only stillness. I let her sob until her words dissolved into choked breaths. I let Julian pace the small patch of carpet until his desperation had nowhere left to go. When they finally fell silent, their eyes fixed on me, waiting for my judgment, my mercy, my solution, I finally spoke. My voice was quiet even, and it cut through their hysteria like a surgeon's scalpel. I looked directly at Claire. "Find somewhere else to die." I said the words falling like stones into a deep well. "You're useless now." She flinched as if I had struck her. A fresh wave of sobs shook her body. "Dad, no. Please don't." "Those were your words, Claire." I continued, my voice never rising. "Not mine. Those were the words you used to throw me out of my home. The home my hands built. The home your mother filled with love. You stood there $33 million richer, and you decided my life, my dignity had no value. You decided I was useless." I turned my gaze to Julian. "And you? You talked about assets and liquidity. You saw a life's worth of memories as an obstacle to your next investment. You saw a grieving father as a line item to be deleted." I stepped back from the doorway, holding their desperate stares. "Your mother's will was not a lottery ticket. It was not a prize to be claimed. It was a responsibility. It was a test of character to see if the daughter she had raised had a soul that was worth more than the numbers in a bank account." My voice grew stronger, filled with a certainty that came from Eleanor herself. "You treated her legacy like a corporate takeover. Now the prize goes to someone who understands the responsibility." Claire looked up, her face a mess of confusion and tears. "What are you going to do?" she whispered. "What does that even mean?" "It means I am going to do what your mother wanted all along," I said. I am going to build something. The Vance Eleanor Foundation is not just a name on a piece of paper. It's a mission. I'm going to use that money to fund scholarships for brilliant young scientists who have ideas, but no resources the way your mother once did. I'm going to create apprenticeships for young craftspeople so that the skills in these hands I held up my own hands don't die out so they aren't erased by men who only know how to click a mouse. I looked at them both, two people who had everything and understood nothing. I am going to build a real legacy, Claire. One made of opportunity and dignity, not of sports cars and designer dresses. A legacy that honors both the mind of your mother and the work of your father. Julian stared at me aghast. You're just going to give it all away. I'm not giving it away, I said. I'm putting it to work, the way it was always meant to be. I stood in the doorway, a final immovable barrier between them and the life they thought they had stolen. They were bankrupt, not just financially, but morally, and they finally knew it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I said, my voice softening just a fraction, not with pity, but with finality. I have a foundation to run. I closed the door. I didn't slam it. I closed it with a quiet, definite click. I didn't listen to their protests or their pleas from the other side. I walked back to the center of the room and stood in the pulsing green light of the neon sign. The abyss was behind me, and in front of me for the first time in a long time was a purpose. A few months can change everything. The house at 45 Serenity Lane was no longer just a house. The quiet corners where grief had settled were now filled with a low, energetic hum of purpose. It was the headquarters of the Vance Eleanor Foundation, and today was its inaugural grant ceremony. The living room where Julian had once plotted its sale was filled with bright, nervous young faces, the first recipients of the Foundation's support. Young scientists clutching research proposals, and young artisans with sketches of their own creations. I stood by the fireplace, the solid warmth of the mantel I'd built beneath my hand, and looked out at the small crowd. I wasn't the master of the house anymore. I was its steward, just as Eleanor had intended. My speech had been short. I spoke of my wife's brilliant mind and my belief in the power of a skilled pair of hands. I spoke of turning pain into purpose. I told them that a legacy wasn't something you inherited, but something you built every single day. In the back of the room near the doorway to the garden stood Claire and Julian. They were almost unrecognizable. Gone were the designer clothes and the air of effortless superiority. They were dressed simply, their shoulders slumped, their faces pale. They looked like strangers at a party they hadn't been invited to, which in a way was true. They didn't try to mingle. They just watched their expressions, a mixture of awe and shame. After the applause faded, and the young grantees began talking excitedly amongst themselves, I made my way through the crowd toward them. I didn't embarrass them. I didn't ignore them. I simply nodded toward my old workshop at the back of the property. Walk with me, I said. The workshop smelled the same as it always had, of cedar and walnut and linseed oil. The tools hung neatly on the walls, clean and ready. It was the one place in the world where I had always been the master of my own creation. We stood in the center of the room, the three of us surrounded by the quiet dignity of my life's work. I'm not going to give you money, I said, my voice even. They both flinched slightly but said nothing. They had expected that. The life you had is over. What you build from now on is up to you. I turned to Claire. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but for the first time in a long time they were clear. Your gallery is struggling, I said. It wasn't a question. Elias had kept me informed. The Foundation is planning to host an exhibition this fall to showcase the work of our artisan grant winners. It needs a curator, someone with an eye for talent, and the connections to bring in the right people. I let the offer hang in the air. It's a chance to use your skills for something real. A way to honor the family legacy you talked about, but this time for real. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She just nodded, a tear tracing a path through the faint dust on her cheek. Then I faced Julian. He wouldn't meet my gaze. He stared at a half-finished table in the corner. "You are a brilliant strategist," I said, and he looked up, surprised. "Your methods were corrupt, but your mind is sharp. The foundation will be vetting hundreds of scientific proposals. We need someone to analyze them to separate the promising from the fanciful, to build a strategy for our investments." His eyes narrowed, searching for the catch. "It's a volunteer position," I said, providing it. "There is no salary. There are no stock options. There is no expense account. There is only a chance to start over. An opportunity to use your mind to build something instead of just taking it apart." I looked from my daughter to my son-in-law. They were broken, yes, but perhaps not beyond repair. The choice was theirs. The path to redemption was open, but it was a hard one, paved with humility and real work. "Let me know what you decide," I said. I left them there in the quiet of my workshop. I didn't wait for an answer. The answer wasn't for me anyway. It was for them. I walked back into the house, back into the light and the noise and the future. A young woman, a biochemist from the university, ran up to me, her face alight with passion. She started explaining her research into neurodegenerative diseases, her hands moving as she talked, sketching complex ideas in the air. I listened. I listened to her dreams, to her ambition, to the fierce intelligence that reminded me so much of my Ellie. A young man, a furniture maker from East Austin, showed me a photo on his phone of a chair he'd designed. We talked about joinery and the challenges of working with reclaimed wood. I was surrounded by creation, by hope, by the powerful, vibrant pulse of a legacy being born. I was no longer the useless old man, discarded and forgotten. I was a source, a builder, an architect of second chances. I had taken the deepest pain of my life and transformed it into a purpose that was bigger than myself. Standing there, shaking the hand of a young craftsman who reminded me of myself all those years ago, I finally understood. I had won. Not by destroying what they had done, but by building something they could never tear down. A true legacy isn't the money you inherit, but the dignity and purpose you build. This story teaches that when faced with greed and betrayal, the best response is not revenge, but transforming pain into a meaningful legacy. If you resonate with this story, please leave a like and share your thoughts on dignity and legacy in the comments below.